A data breach at Uber in 2016 revealed the private information of over 57 million users. For Tech Republic and ZDNet, my name is Dan Patterson. Data breaches happen all the time. A data breach at Uber could spell big trouble for the company, but it also is a learning exercise, or it's an opportunity for many companies to learn about what happened and prevent that from happening at their company. For Tech Republic and ZDNet, I'm Dan Patterson with BioCatch VP Francis Zelazny. Francis, thank you very much for joining us today. I wonder if we could first start by summarizing what happened at Uber that led to the exposure of almost 60 million accounts.
So thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be here. I think, put simply, according to Uber, hackers accessed the data through a third-party cloud service. Essentially, hacking into that, they found the username and passwords to the Uber data that was then stored in an Amazon server. This really should not be that much of a surprise to anyone, considering that we've seen through numerous breaches over the last several years that hackers are in the business of looking for ways to continue and steal information. And the easiest way to do that is essentially starting through some sort of a brute force attack where you have access to other usernames and passwords, and then you use that to then proceed to get into larger and larger databases. And obviously, with the amount of consumer information that Uber has, given the size of their company, they are a prime target, just like any other very large enterprise.
So if we leave, there's a larger conversation happening within technology circles about Uber itself, and we put that into a bucket, and that's a great conversation we can have later. But first, the more important conversation, the more germane conversation is how this breach happened and how other companies can guard against breaches like this. Certainly Uber was not the only one. Equifax is easily another example. Yahoo is yet another example. So if I run anything from a large SMB all the way up to an enterprise company, how can I look at, first, what happened here that I can use to prevent breaches at my company? And then how can I institute policies or practices that prevent breaches like this?
So first of all, I think it's important to understand, I think one of the statistics that I read last week that says every 39 seconds there's an attack on a computer that has internet access. So this is not something that is, just for the very large companies. This is something that is happening all the time, and securing this information is, really a cat and mouse game of, strengthening endpoints and putting together all sorts of ways to prevent breaches in the first place. But I think in some ways, what we really need to do is think about, this in a completely different way, and assume that in some ways, the boat has already sailed. So, and we know this because more than 9 billion records have been stolen in the last 4 years. So obviously, we need to be prudent and put together some very strong cybersecurity practices. And there are different frameworks. NIST has a very good cybersecurity framework. New York State recently put out some regulations around strengthening cybersecurity. A lot of it starts with risk assessment, and I think really becomes a reality when people don't think that just by checking the boxes and being compliant that you have security. So it's really about thinking about how fraudsters behave and what hackers are really trying to do. Bearing in mind, again, that every 39 seconds there is some sort of an attack that's coming from somewhere. And another scary statistic which came out in a survey that NASDAQ did last year was that 90% of corporate executives said that they weren't prepared to handle a major attack. So what this really means is that perhaps, we should think about, okay, if the attack happens, now what? What does this really mean for my business? And what does it really mean for how I need to handle and prevent the damage from happening after these breaches occur. So number one is resilience. So how do you respond, and how do you react as a company? And I think there's a lot of pushback in the way Uber handled it, quite frankly, in a cover up and paying a ransom. So I think how a company reacts and how you build resilience back into the organization is key. I think the second thing is really a culture of accountability in terms of what strong security is and how people really define who people really are when they are transacting remotely. So whether they're applying for a credit card, or whether they're trying to make a payment, or whether they're trying to access their bank account or calling the call center. What does it really mean when somebody says, they know their name, their social security number, their mother's maiden name, their pet's name, the address? I mean, all of this is static information. Usernames and passwords are also static information, and passwords can be essentially guessed after a certain amount of tries. So I think changing all of this and the way we think about this is really the key to making the information that hackers are stealing less valuable, if you will, less the identity information less valuable, by adding different measures and dynamic ways of really ascertaining identity. So if your mother's maiden name is no longer your ticket to applying for a credit card, then that information essentially is not the end all be all, and hackers, will go somewhere else. And this is a major mind shift that needs to happen.
It is, and I'm so glad you mentioned passwords in there. I know you work for a biosecurity company, or biometric security company, but one of the number one ways hackers access data is, as we know, through phishing and through stealing credentials, usernames, and passwords, which is another great way to get static information. Like you said, a mother's maiden name, where you went to elementary school. All of those are easily phishable, which is a pretexting and social engineering, which is an old school hacking tactic. So I wonder if we could kind of pivot this then and talk about biometric security. That's been in the news since Apple introduced the thumbprint scan, and now with the iPhone 10 using Face ID. I wonder if these are solutions or they're just different forms of passwords. How does biometric security keep us more secure?
So biometrics in general are technologies that bind a user to their identity. When we talk about logging in, using biometrics for login, it's essentially, you can think about it in different science fiction and edge cases, but essentially when a person presents a biometric, you have a very high confidence that it is the correct person. The key to understand, however, is that a lot of the fraud happens in authenticated sessions. And so a person can authenticate themselves via a token or even a PIN or a password. It could really be the right person. But what we've found is that a lot of the social engineering happens afterwards. So people are tricked into allowing fraudsters access into their account, downloading TeamViewer or LogMeIn or some other tools. And the reason that they're tricked is that the fraudsters have enough personal information that they've stolen via via hacking, in order to convince the person on the other end that they're, really from their bank. And so I think that's a really important point that people need to be educated on. The role of biometrics really does bind the person to their identity. And this goes back to the fingerprint, face, iris, voice, and all of those biometrics are handling that very, very well for the logon. A new modality, behavioral biometrics, is really providing the continuous authentication layer to prevent these account takeovers that happen via social engineering.
So I wonder, Francis, if you could leave us with a few solutions. Obviously, nobody in cyber has solutions, but you did a fantastic job there pointing out some of the kind of scary flaws in token-based or auth-based attacks. if I run a company, I may be listening to this and go, okay, I got those best practices, but what should I actually do to make sure I don't experience a data breach like what occurred at Uber?
So I think there are two main areas that we need to address. One is if I'm a credit card company, for example, an issuer, how do I issue credit cards to people based on their actual identity and not based on information that is being just presented? So having a different mindset and deploying technologies, dynamic technologies. So behavioral biometrics is just one example, but there are other ways to do that, that are looking beyond the data layer. From a cybersecurity standpoint, not to be complacent that just following regulation and being compliant is really security, but really thinking about, what data is stored, where it's stored, and using, again, dynamic methods in order to provide access and looking at whether it makes sense, whether, what the activity that is being done, does that make sense for the actual user? There are many, many techniques, and a layered approach essentially is key.